Is inflation headed higher or lower in the new year ahead? We'll put that question to the man who was once called Washington's inflation czar tonight on In Touch.
This is In Touch with Paul Simon, a weekly report from your congressman on the issues that concern you the most. And now, Congressman Paul Simon.
We're very pleased this week to have as our special guest Dr. Alfred Kahn, who's now a member of the faculty at Cornell University and one of the ranking members of the faculty there, but is known for a great variety of other things, including being an author. He is sometimes called the father of deregulation, and during the Carter years was sometimes referred to as the inflation czar. He was President Carter's appointee in that area. It is not really fair to call you an inflation czar because you were never really given the power to get a hold of things. Isn't that correct?
Oh, that's a wonderful misnomer. Besides, Paul, you remember what happened to the last czar in Russia in 1917. A czar without any power, that's right.
And probably, and I realize this is retrospect, but probably it was a mistake on the part of the president not to give you some unusual powers because in order to get a hold of inflation, we had to do some things that were unpopular, and we still have to do some things that are unpopular.
No question that we still have to do things that are unpopular. Whether under our system of government anybody should have that kind of power, I don't know. I think the president thought of it as having somebody whose sole preoccupation was the inflation problem and who could somehow try to educate the American people about what it took to bring it under control.
But in fact, what you needed was the ability to knock cabinet heads together and with a little greater leverage than in fact you were given.
Oh, there's no question about that, Paul. It was in many ways a frustrating situation to find oneself in. But of course, inflation is a frustratingly difficult problem. And people can agree in general about what we ought to do, but as soon as you get to the details, it gores somebody's ox. And then the special interests come out and say, well, I mean control spending, but I don't mean to limit my spending.
And the same is true in deregulation. You achieved fame on the national scene for moving in the direction of deregulation, but you found out you were goring oxes along the line.
Well, of course you did. The difference was that I had authority. I was chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board. And when it became clear to me that the government had been protecting the carriers from competition. It was just old protectionism. And the CAB was running a big cartel. Then I could begin to change things. I could begin to admit new airlines, like Midway Airlines, for example, which came in and was giving service to Midway Airport in Chicago at 25 to 40 or 50% off the regular fares. So that was a beautiful situation where I was in a position to do something. And while, of course, we've had some problems since because fuel prices have doubled and we have a recession, I'm persuaded that that was a really very successful step in restoring that industry to the free enterprise system.
It not only restored the industry over the objection of the industry, but
right. Helped
the consumers of this nation.
Well, that's the important thing,
yeah.
Paul. I mean, in the first year, we estimate that consumers saved about $2.5 billion. There are still bargains available. Look at Midway Airlines. I'm a director of New York Air, which is competing with Eastern on the shuttle. And in some places in Cleveland, we have fares 1/2 the level of the fares before. And we can make money at that level. So I think it's been good for the public.
Now, what happens in the future on, we get your skills as a prophet out now, Fred. What happens in the future both on inflation and on deregulation? Let's take inflation first.
Well, it certainly looks as though the inflation rate will taper down from the double-digit level. We haven't made as much progress as people think. The main benefit has been that energy prices, which went wild in 79 and 80, just when I had the misfortune to be in the White House, are now stable. But if you set aside that food has been behaving well, and of course farmers are suffering from that, and energy prices, you find underneath there just maybe a point or two is the most we've gotten off. But I think as we get into 1982, the recession, unemployment is going to slow down wage increases, and so that's probably going to bring the rate down. The question is that a victory? I mean, if you can achieve it only by having unemployment rise to 9 and maybe 10%, that may be the best bargain we can strike, but it isn't a very good bargain for the American
And I know to strike a better bargain, you have to do a great variety of things. But what are
Some of
three or
them?
four of those things, very briefly?
Well, you know, I can really cite nothing better than that report you wrote when you were chairman of the inflation subcommittee or task force or the budget committee. That was a superb report. You could publish it today and still be proud of it, Paul. I think, in part, sure, we do have to restrict government spending. And I think President Reagan deserves some credit for having made major limitations on government spending. I wouldn't cut all the places he's cutting, and I'd cut more in other places. But that surely is one step. I think, second, that defense spending has got to be subjected to the same kind of careful scrutiny, however, as civilian spending. And I don't really think the president's doing that.
No, and Dave Stockman's article in the Atlantic magazine
Admitted that.
Yeah,
Admitted
that's
that.
correct.
Dave Stockman was an honest man in
Right.
that article in the Atlantic. Third, I don't know whether we can undo it, but that ideological leap into the future with a 3-year 25% cut in personal income taxes, people in the administration said, oh, that's going to give confidence to the security markets. That's going to show that we're going to move ahead with the economy. I remember saying, and I think you were saying, that that's dangerous. With inflation so much a danger, to commit ourselves 2 and 3 years down to the future to such big cuts may set off fears of inflation. Well, that's just what happened. Interest rates jumped way, way up, and of course that's partly why we have the recession now.
And I can remember when a fellow named Fred Kahn was telling us this could happen. And it was not only you, but Arthur Burns was saying
That's
the same
right.
thing. Paul Volcker was saying the same thing.
Exactly. Paul Volcker was saying it. Paul Volcker was saying, please don't put all the burden of fighting inflation on me, on restricted money policy, and have what's really a loose budget. I mean, the president has cut civilian spending, but he's increasing defense spending even more. And then with those big tax cuts, it's really sort of the way it was in 1966, 7, 8, and 9, when with the Vietnam War, we tried to have guns and butter. So I think that was really a serious mistake. I think, in addition, we've got to explore ways of getting more modest wage settlements. I mean, I can understand individual workers and unions saying, well, we've got to catch up with the consumer price index. But we're involved in this kind of leapfrogging in which each year people try to catch up with the people the previous year. And the result is really this inflation, these high interest rates, and the high unemployment that we have. And I'd like to see a president try to strike a bargain and say, I'm prepared to speed up the tax cut now, just now. I'm not talking about in the future, but right now in the recession, give up this foolish attempt further to cut social programs, which is really creating misery. A recession is not the time to do that, in exchange for some agreement on the part of organized labor that they will try to hold wage increases to productivity. Now, productivity isn't going up at all, but you can't have wages go up 7, 8, and 9%, which is what they're doing, Paul. And that's 75% of our national income goes to wages. It's just frustrating because if productivity doesn't go up, costs go up 8% and inflation will go up.
If President Reagan were to accept that kind of a program, do you think he could sell it to the leaders of organized labor?
Well, I can only hope. I tried to sell it. At that time, it was very difficult. But now, with the suffering that we're seeing among automobile workers, particularly, and steel workers and rubber tire workers, where it's really quite clear that the problem is that that industry has priced itself out of the market, and the suffering is directly related to the wages. If we could say, look, there's a better bargain here. If we could stop trying to race faster and faster to keep even with ourselves, and we can get better employment and a recovery of the economy, we'd all be better off. I have some hope that we may have learned that lesson.
We're going to get back to you with some additional questions, and one question from one of the constituents in just a moment. One of a congressman's major duties is to help constituents who are having problems with federal programs, such as Medicare, black lung, and Social Security. If you're having a problem with these or other federal programs, I urge you to write, phone, or visit one of my district offices. The people in my Carbondale and West Frankfort offices are trained to help you cut through the red tape that too often surrounds government agencies. Where it's necessary, I'll personally intervene in your behalf. My Carbondale office is located in the Federal Building at 250 West Cherry Street. The phone number is 457-3653. My West Frankfort office is located at 212 West Main Street. The phone number there is 932-2560. My offices are there to serve you. I hope you'll use them. Our question for this week comes from Mrs. Maureen Cruz, who writes from Waterloo that her hospitalization insurance that covers both herself and her husband will jump several $100s next year. This brings up not only the question of health costs, but the whole question of deregulation, how much of it we should have, what we can do. You have done more in this area than any other person in the United States. Where do we go? How do we answer Mrs. Cruz on health care costs and the whole regulation, deregulation question?
It's a big question, Paul, as you know. I'd like to start with the deregulation one because it fits in with your previous question about what we can do about inflation. One of the reasons that I, in the White House, after I left the Civil Aeronautics Board, spent a lot of my time pushing for deregulation, for avoiding protectionism and limiting competition from foreigners, is that seems to me one of the most important fundamental ways of attacking inflation. The government has got to get out of the business of protecting people from competition, and that's what regulation was doing. And deregulation of the airlines and deregulation of the trucking, for which I fought so hard, the purpose of that was to eliminate these crazy restrictions on who might go where and what they might carry. You know, you can carry logs if they're cut this way, but not if they're cut this way. Or you may carry painted 5-gallon tins, but not 2-gallon tins.
Or you have to go somewhere with a full load and come back with an empty load.
Precisely. And the competition that we have unleashed by deregulation in airlines and in trucking is already producing results in forcing them to be more efficient. And that means improved productivity. And that, in the long run, is one of the main ways that we have to attack inflation. We've got to present the American people with the prospect that their income can go up each year. Well, that depends upon productivity, and that depends upon the pressures of competition. So I don't mean that I want to deregulate everywhere. I mean, I think that there's consumer protection regulation that's needed, public utility regulation. But in those many cases in which the government has stepped in to protect existing people and to keep out private enterprisers, minority businessmen who wanted to get into the trucking business. I remember several women who were trying to get into the trucking business, and the ICC said no, because you'll compete with existing people. So there, competition is our main way of protecting the public.
But what about now healthcare? It almost looks like more regulation is needed in order to keep costs back. What's the answer?
Well, that's a much more difficult one. In some important measure, healthcare expenditures have been going up because medical science has been developing more and more ways, expensive ways, of treating illness. The CAT scanner, for example, which is an incredibly effective diagnostic tool, is very, very costly. I think the main defect in the healthcare industry is that the great bulk of health care is not paid for by the patient directly. And so the patient and the doctor doesn't pay for it. And so the doctor will say to me, if I have my back hurts me, as it sometimes does, he'll say, well, I may as well put you in the hospital because you don't pay for it. Why bother your wife? It gets paid for by a third party, an insurance company. So one way of attacking the healthcare problem, and it's going to take a long time, is to try, where possible, to introduce more competition.
And I hate to say it, on that note, we're going to have to cut you off.
Too bad.
It's been a real pleasure to have Dr. Alfred Kahn, the inflation czar under President Jimmy Carter, as a special guest here on our program, In Touch.
This has been In Touch with Paul Simon, a weekly report from your congressman on the issues that concern you the most, presented as a public service by this station. If you would like Congressman Simon to answer one of your questions on the show, send your question and your name and address to In Touch, Congressman Paul Simon, 227 Cannon House Office Building, Washington, D.C., 20515.